yes, it's true that postpartum cycles vary from one woman to the next, and then all sorts of factors are involved in them: how much sleep you're getting, how your baby's eating, what your pumping schedule is, if applicable. But here are the trends that I want you to be aware of in postpartum menstrual cycles. Hey, lady. Welcome to the Postpartum on Purpose podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 5 beautiful kids, ages 9 and under, with 1 miscarried baby. Here we see postpartum, all the way from birth to the first year of life, as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 86. Hi, lady. If you are listening in real time or close to real time, I am recording during Holy Week. Easter will be on Sunday. Today is Spy Wednesday, and I will be off next week in observance of the Easter octave. Let's get started with free things. If you've been around a minute, you know that free things is mental shorthand for a reminder that no matter how big the size of our family or our budget, a full, rich, meaningful life is available to all of us. And also just a reminder that there's always something for which we can be grateful. Free things this week. 1, I had to take my oldest to the pediatrician's office this morning because he got some bug bites that were substantially growing in the last couple of days after he went caving and swimming under a waterfall. Doesn't that sound fancy? Out of state over the weekend. When we left the office, the kids got stickers and suckers, and then also a little take-home crafts of you put magnets on the back, but I can't remember what the material is made out of. It's not felt anyhow, but it's Easter themed craft. That's the point. An Easter themed craft. And all of that was totally free to them. I really appreciated that those things were offered to us because it's not an easy thing to get 5 kids out of the house and squeezed into a doctor's office. That helped. And it made the transition out of the office better too, because even if you're a little grumpy in the office because you're not behaving and you're sitting on the floor, and please don't be putting your fingers in your mouth and you've been touching every surface in this room and your hands are hand sanitized. But then to leave on a positive note sort of ushers you out the door in a happy way. The other free thing that I wanted to make note of this week, and I hope you can think of an example of this in your life too, lady, is that I was offered the gift of flexibility by my hairstylist. I was supposed to have a haircut this afternoon, and as of this week, my husband is coaching my son's baseball team, and their practices are Mondays and Wednesdays. I'm recording on Wednesday. I realized over the weekend that it just wasn't going to work out. The timing of this haircut that I'd had planned for a long time, and then being able to get a babysitter, I just wasn't able to do it for the other 4 kids. And I texted my stylist on Monday morning because I didn't want to text her over the weekend. I at least had the presence of mind to do that, thank God. But I texted her on Monday morning and just said, hey, I am so sorry, but is there another time this week that I can get my hair cut because I'm not able to make it for this reason? She texted me back. She said, what about earlier in the day, essentially today? And at first I said, yeah, that's great. And then 8 hours later, I texted her and just said oh, actually, no, it's not. No, I'm still not available for a different reason. But I'm still not available because my son has piano lessons and I will then have all of the children with me. But anyhow, so it was kind of her to once again accommodate my schedule. And granted, over text, right? So she might have felt a little frustrated with me, but there was no frustration communicated via text. She just said, okay, well then let's try for X another day and time. And that works great. It is a real gift to receive flexibility from other people rather than frustration or chastisement or even just sort of petty nitpicking. And I hope that you were able to look at something from your life this week and be grateful that, yeah, somebody offered you some flexibility too. One small change, and if you've been around a minute also, you know that one small change represents this concept that there's always something that is progressing or shifting during postpartum, whether it's for you as the mom or your baby or for the both of you. And the one small change this week was that I ran 1.7 continuous miles for the first time in my life. And I'm 36 years old. Now, according to some estimates, it would have been an extraordinarily slow run or maybe on par with the world's very fastest fast walkers. It was not speedy. It was not a speedy run, but it was continuous. And I've done it a couple of times since then. And I'm just really grateful that I was able to do that. All right. briefly today because you don't need all of the extensive research on this. But I just wanted to talk about how postpartum cycles tend to differ from regular cycles. And the value in knowing this, one, is just to be aware of it, but also to be able to see this episode will be the building block for next episode, explaining why fertility awareness, or NFP, natural family planning, can be really difficult during postpartum. And not just because, oh, you're tired and you forgot to chart, or you're tired and you forgot to make observations, right? It's not just on you. The methods themselves are difficult to use during postpartum, and next week we'll get into that. But the building block, the basis, the foundation for being able to understand that is knowing first, how do postpartum cycles tend to differ from cycles in naturally cycling non-pregnant women. And the first thing I just want you to be aware of is that breastfeeding shifts the playing field for postpartum moms. So when I'm talking about postpartum cycles, I am talking about a rather specific type of woman, and that is a breastfeeding woman whose baby suckles at the breast, right? Because actually, fertility tends to return somewhere between 6 and 13 weeks after birth for a woman whose baby is completely formula fed, not breastfed at all. And then women who exclusively pump or pump fairly regularly, as you would during a workday, tend to have a sooner return of fertility also. Perhaps not as soon as a mom who is completely bottle feeding, or formula feeding, but certainly sooner than a woman who's breastfeeding. But so, okay, this is the woman that I just want to carve out who specifically I'm referring to here. The type of woman that I'm referring to is somebody who is breastfeeding and her baby is latching at the breast. All right. So for breastfeeding moms, we know that generally speaking, you have high prolactin levels when you are breastfeeding. And those high prolactin levels suppress the hormones that you need to ovulate. Okay? So the high prolactin from breastfeeding will suppress the hormones that otherwise would be rising in order for you to ovulate. Hopefully you already know that in the first part of a cycle, right, in the first part of a normal menstrual cycle, estrogen will rise significantly. You'll have an LH surge, and that will trigger ovulation. Ovulation is just the release of a mature egg from the ovary, and that egg was housed in what's called a follicle. The leftovers of that follicle after you ovulate are called a corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum releases progesterone. And if you look at a chart of your hormones across the menstrual cycle, you have a large rise in estrogen before you ovulate and a smaller rise again after you ovulate. But then the biggest hormonal shift after ovulation is this rise in progesterone. And that's coming directly from the corpus luteum, which is just the leftovers of that follicle that burst and released the mature egg during ovulation. Okay. Here's what this all means. When you have high prolactin, you have lower levels of the hormones that lead to the LH, it makes your LH surge, and the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that leads those follicles to mature, and then the estrogen to rise, and then the LH to surge. So all of that to say, as your prolactin is raised from breastfeeding, as the prolactin is raised, your other hormone levels tend to be suppressed during that time. Okay? Most women will have a return of fertility somewhere between a couple of months and a year if they are breastfeeding, but a small percentage of women will not have a return of their cycles until they are completely weaned, even if that's 12 or 18 months later. And then another small percentage, so if you picture a bell curve, on the very furthest end, you've got some women who won't get their period back until they are not breastfeeding at all anymore. But then on the left side of that curve, you will have women like my sister who fully breastfed each of her 3 babies for the first 6 months, and yet her cycle returned earlier and earlier each time. And the latest I think it returned was 8 weeks. With her 3rd baby, it returned at 3 or 4 weeks. So yes, for most women, especially those who are exclusively breastfeeding, you're going to have return of fertility somewhere between 3 and 12 months. And if you meet very specific criteria that you can look up on the internet, you smart lady you, For lactational amenorrhea, you have a 98% effectiveness and only a 2% unintended pregnancy rate if you meet those criteria for the first 6 months postpartum. Okay. All of this to say, though, it's not simply a case of one day your hormones pop on or turn on, and then you ovulate, and then now you're in regular cycles. In reality, your body tends to go through a series of warm-ups or practice runs before that first ovulation occurs. Okay? Before that first ovulation occurs. And you tend to need to have a much stronger LH surge in order for ovulation to happen. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, how the heck am I going to know if I have a strong LH surge? Because if you have ovulation test strips, like LH test strips, those are just going to be positive or negative. And if you use the Clear Blue Fertility Monitor as part of the Marquette method, those are just going to say low, high, or peak, right? So you're not going to have a sense from there. But if you were to check your LH levels, your quantitative levels, meaning actual numbers, you're getting at-home lab data number values with the mirror monitor, for instance, or the Anito or Prove, I believe, you would see this very significant rise in LH. So I believe in normally cycling women, anything over 15 is considered like indicating that your LH surge is happening. In my first LH surge, testing with the mirror monitor before, like for the first ovulation that I had, my LH was 170. And the ovulation after that, it was 79. And then I think this last one, it was over 90. So just to give you a sense, you tend to need a much stronger LH surge in order for ovulation to occur. And then also, if you were tracking your hormone levels with a mirror monitor and had some sense of like what their numbers were, you would tend to see in early postpartum, meaning both, and by this I mean both before your cycle returns and in those first 6 cycles postpartum, you tend to have lower estrogen levels altogether. So if you were to look at your hormone profile and see like what's going on, oftentimes you may have what seems like you're starting maybe a fertile cycle. So if you're just tracking cervical mucus observations, maybe you're starting to see what looks like some fertile type mucus, and then maybe it just goes away and your period never follows it. And then maybe later on you have some fertile type mucus, it appears again, right? And if you were using the Clear Blue Fertility Monitor, you might get a high reading, but then 10 days later, maybe you reset the monitor, right? After 10 days, you reset the monitor, and then it just goes to low. Like it never went to peak. It just goes back to low. Or maybe, as in my case, after my 4th baby was born, maybe it just stays high for a couple of months and never seems to drop down until finally it seems like the machine kind of like gets that, oh, you have a higher level than what, and it sets a new baseline for you. But all of that simply to say you can have these periods where something seems to be happening and then it goes away again. And something seems to be happening and then it goes away again. And that can be because your estrogen is just not rising the way that it would need to in order to have ovulation occur. And that also your ovaries seem to need, at least at first, they seem to need a lot more stimulation from the LH, which is why you might have just these exponentially higher LH surges at first, in that first ovulation, and then maybe a couple of cycles after that, in order for the body to do what it needs to do to ovulate. Okay. Now, after your first period has come back, and maybe you had this crazy LH surge, maybe your estrogen levels weren't really that high, but after your ovulation has occurred, or your periods come back, and this is something I want to point out too. Generally speaking, we say that true menstruation, a period, only follows ovulation, but this is not quite right for postpartum women. Sometimes you will have several periods before you actually ovulate. Now, if you're just doing cervical mucus observations, are you going to know that? No, not necessarily. If you're just doing basal body temperature observations, are you going to know that? No, not necessarily. But if you were to look at the quantitative values, like the lab values, then yes, you would generally be able to see that more clearly. Like, oh yeah, these are signs of ovulation. Or if your period comes, generally speaking, you'd guess that too. All right, so the couple of things that I want you to pay attention for, or just to know, like, yeah, this is sort of expected in my first couple of cycles postpartum. After that first ovulation or period, you will tend to have longer cycles. Now, over time, should they shorten and become more regular? Yes, you bet. But it's not necessarily going to be a linear thing. And by that, I mean, it's not necessarily going to mean your first cycle's 50 days and then your second cycle's 45 and your third cycle's 40. And so it's not necessarily going to be the stair step pattern. It may be like 50 days and then 40 and then 45 and then 32 and then 36 and then 30, right? And then maybe 30 is your new normal after that. I just want you to be aware that you can tend to have these longer cycles, and while they will shorten over time gradually, it's not necessarily just going to be every cycle is a little bit shorter than the one before it. Also, you can expect a longer follicular phase, and that just means when the follicle is growing before ovulation. You can expect a longer pre-ovulation phase during these first 6 cycles postpartum, or before you stop breastfeeding. Because in all of this, the first 6 cycles postpartum assumes that you're still breastfeeding at least some amount. But if you were to stop breastfeeding altogether, completely wean before the first 6 cycles are up, then you would now have a whole new set of protocols for whatever fertility awareness method or natural family planning method that you're using, because you are now considered to be closer to somebody in regular cycles than you are to the postpartum cycles. All right. So longer follicular phase, longer cycles overall. And you could have a longer follicular phase even within a cycle that isn't actually that long. And here's an example. You might have a 25-day follicular phase, even if your cycle overall is only 30 or 31 days. Now, how could you do that? You might be thinking. All right. So if we break your cycle down into 2 phases, the follicular phase, which happens before ovulation, and the luteal phase, which remember I talked about the corpus luteum before. That's the luteal phase, is that phase from ovulation until your new period starts, your next period comes. You can have a very short luteal phase during postpartum cycles as well. So you may have longer cycles altogether, including longer follicular phases, but that luteal phase may be short or quite short. Normally, we'd want a minimum of 9 days for luteal phase, for that to indicate that you have healthy hormone levels that would mean that you're capable of getting pregnant again if you wanted to, like if you were trying to conceive, okay? Minimum of 9 days, but really you'd like it to be somewhere between 10 and 14. Now, you want it to be very stable. Once you're in regular cycles, you want it to be very, very stable for you every time. So if you always have 12 days, like it should always be 12 days. If it's usually 14, it should always be 14. But somewhere between 10 and 14 days, we would like for a healthy luteal phase length for us to know, yeah, this is a good indicator that you have hormones operating the way that they ought to be. You've got, your body is operating the way it ought to be from a hormonal perspective. But that luteal phase may be short because your hormones are just not where they need to be yet. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not even really unexpected. Again, recall when you are breastfeeding and you have high prolactin, even though the prolactin is going to shift over time, and it's going to shift again when you are starting to wean. So like in my case, I take out 1 feeding every month from starting at 6 months so that by a year the baby's completely weaned, all right? So as you're downgrading your level of baby nursing at the breast, your hormones, your prolactin hormone is going to start decreasing as part of that, which means that your other levels are going to start raising. But while you are still breastfeeding at all, you will potentially see some suppression of the estrogen, some suppression of the progesterone. And what that will look like in your charting, no matter what method of charting you're using, what that can look like is this shorter luteal phase. Some women will find, and this is what happened to my sister who had the cycles return so early that I talked about, they will find that first luteal phase might be 3 days and your period starts, or 4 days and your period starts, okay? Now, that short luteal phase is not consistent with being healthy enough for conception to occur successfully. So just to be aware of that. That short luteal phase is generally not going to be able to support to support conception and implantation of a healthy pregnancy. But these are the things I just want you to be aware of, lady, that in general, your postpartum cycles after your first ovulation or period has occurred will tend to be longer cycles overall, but shortening over time. They will tend to be longer follicular phases, so that first part of the cycle before ovulation occurs is going to tend to be longer than it would be in regular cycles. And then your luteal phase will tend to be shorter, and over time it should get longer. So your follicular phase will get shorter. Your overall cycle length should get shorter. And your luteal phase, that part of the cycle from ovulation until your next period, will tend to get longer as well. Those are just things I want you to have some sense of, lady, for your information, for your peace of mind, so that if you are charting your cycle after baby, you can have some sense of, okay, is this kind of expected within the postpartum range of normal, which is very, very wide. But of course, always at the end of the day, I am not your fertility awareness teacher, your NFP instructor. Get help from an NFP instructor. Get help from an NFP instructor so you don't have to go it alone. This is not worth DIYing. It's certainly not worth the anxiety of wondering what is going on and is this normal, is it not? I'm simply trying to offer you a couple of trends, a couple of patterns that you might expect to see. But for all of the questions that you will inevitably have, because I've been there and done that, about your particular cycle and what's going on in your body in this particular part of your cycle, in this part of the first 6 cycles postpartum, or before you have fully breastfed or fully weaned from breastfeeding, get in touch with somebody from an evidence-based method. Natural Womanhood's website can help point you to instructors in all of the evidence-based methods, whether you want to use a cervical mucus-based method, if you want to use a symptothermal method, if you want to track your urinary hormones, like through the Marquette method. You can find a certified instructor in all of those places. The internet is your friend for that, for sure. But do not go it alone, lady. Do not go it alone. Next episode, like I said, after taking a week off for Easter, next episode, I'm going to talk about why specifically fertility awareness methods and NFP, natural family planning, can be so challenging for postpartum moms, and why that's not necessarily your fault, and why that tends to translate to a lot of extra abstinence, which neither you nor I love, but we can at least understand some of why that's occurring and what the purpose of that is, so that it doesn't seem just absolutely worthless and futile. I hope you have a great rest of your week, lady. I'll talk to you later.